Hello, in this podcast we're going to be learning about natural selection, and our learning target for this podcast is that we will understand how the process of natural selection drives evolution. Prior to this podcast, we learned about a theory of descent with modification. This was the first of two theories that Darwin proposed, and this theory briefly states that populations and species change over time, and that present-day species evolved from earlier, distinctly different species. In today's podcast, we're looking at the mechanism for that, answering the question, how do species evolve? There are several methods on how this is done. We're only going to be looking at a few of them. One is that random mutations will add new genes, and this increases variation. And we'll see the importance of variation in natural selection. And most mutations, or practically all mutations, are random. Mutagens can cause mutations. What the mutation is, like what letters change to what letter, what the deletion is, what the insertion is, all of those are random. Also, sexual reproduction mixes genes that causes new gene combinations and new phenotypes. The mixing comes from a variety of things. During fertilization, when the genes from the eggs and the sperms combine, and that itself is mixing. You have half the genes from one parent and half the genes from the other parent, or half chromosomes from one parent, half chromosomes from another parent. The meiosis itself involves some mixing in that you have two copies of every chromosome. It's randomly determined which copy goes into each gamete. It's like flipping a coin as to which one goes to which. And the last way that there's variation is through recombination, in that the homologous chromosomes will basically swap segments. And the last of the two gives direction to evolution. It'll allow species to adapt, and that is natural selection. And that natural selection chooses which genes become common and which are eliminated. I'm going to show you a quick little clip which will give you an overview of natural selection.
How does evolution really work?
The primary way that evolution occurs is through the action of natural selection. That is, populations change in response to environmental pressures, and they become adapted to new conditions, and they change over time.
Following Charles Darwin's lead, biologist Chris Schneider and his colleagues traveled to Ecuador to study the evolution of several animal species. This lush rainforest is a natural laboratory for ongoing investigation of evolutionary theory. Natural selection is at the core of their research on hummingbirds.
In our research, we're trying to understand how new species arise. This is Darwin's fundamental question. On the origin of species, how do new species arise? And what we're finding is that natural selection seems to be an incredibly important factor in generating new species.
Natural selection, the key evolutionary mechanism Darwin identified, is really four processes: genetic variation, overproduction of offspring, struggle for existence, and differential survival and reproduction. First, genetic variation. Individuals within a species vary from one to the other. For evolution to work by natural selection, the characteristics that give an individual an advantage in a certain environment have to be passed on from one generation to the next.
And in hummingbirds, bill length seems to have a very strong genetic basis. That is, if two parents mate and both of those parents have long bills, their offspring will have long bills. If those parents have shorter bills, their offspring will have shorter bills.
Second, there is overproduction of offspring.
Darwin realized that natural selection would operate because individuals in natural populations tend to produce more offspring than can survive. For example, hummingbirds over their lifetime will often produce dozens of offspring, but only one or two of those individuals are likely to survive.
The third factor in natural selection is the struggle for existence, and that leads to differential survival and reproduction.
In any population, whether it's plants or animals or whatever, this excess production of individuals results in what Darwin called the struggle for existence. And what he had in mind there, I think, was the competition for food and space and mates as well. Hummingbirds compete for nectar. They often compete very fiercely for limited resources. Natural selection will favor individuals that are more efficient at getting nectar, and natural selection will result in changes in wing shape that allow hummingbirds to fly longer distances, for instance, or maybe to be more maneuverable, to maneuver around flowers and get nectar more efficiently. And probably most importantly, it'll affect the length and shape of the bill.
Bill measurements.
In the case of hummingbirds, we know that a 1 or 2 millimeter change in length can have profound differences on how efficiently that bird feeds and how well it survives.
Individual survivors are more likely to reproduce and pass on their advantageous as well as other genes to their offspring. In an environment with long flowers, having a long bill is an advantageous trait. Not necessarily the absolute best trait always, just a better one in this environment. Hummingbirds with small bills may not survive, and eventually there will only be hummingbirds with long bills. Over a long period of time, the entire population of hummingbirds adapts to the shape and size of the flowers that exist in that environment.
If you're in the woods and you're walking with another person and you come on a bear and the bear chases you, you don't have to be faster than the bear. You only have to be faster than the other person because the bear eats them and you get away.
Species cannot develop the adaptations that benefit them in their lifetimes. Just as you cannot make your arm longer to reach a book on a shelf up high, individual small-billed hummingbirds that move into an area where there are longer flowers can't make their bills longer. Their bill length is determined by the DNA they inherited from their parents.
Darwin emphasized over and over, repeatedly in The Origin of Species, the fact that small changes would accrue every generation, and that over the enormous length of time that life has been present on Earth, these changes could build up to amount to enormous changes.
It was Charles Darwin's genius to have identified natural selection as the central force in evolution.
And I think that in research over the last 10 or 15 years has really supported that. I think most evolutionary biologists would agree that natural selection is probably the single most important force in evolution.
Now we're going to go back and look in a little more detail at each of the components of natural selection. First one is overproduction. And overproduction basically means that in each species that the number of offspring produced are more than what is needed to just simply replace what there is. We could show mathematically is that if each individual survives to reproduce, eventually you'll end up with the entire world taken over by that particular species. It's even true for elephants, which is one of the slowest reproducing species on this planet. So with all that overproduction, why aren't we overtaken by elephants or other things which reproduce a lot quicker? And the reason why is because there's a struggle for existence. There is a struggle for resources. There's for food, for territory, for mates. And there is a struggle not to be eaten. And there's also variation. Just look around in the classroom or look around even in your family where all of you are close, where you're all very, very closely related. There still is variation in every single population. Even in an asexual population, there is still some variation because there still is variation that comes from mutations, so that it's a lot less than it is in a sexual population, but there still is some variation. And when there's variation in some environments, one particular variant may have an advantage over another, and in a different environment, that same variant, that same difference, may give a disadvantage. And that brings us to the last of the components of natural selection, and I'm using a the more popular name of it than what they had in the video clip, survival of the fittest. And basically those genetic variants that give individuals advantages in the struggle for existence are fitter than those that don't. So these individuals who have the fitter genes have a better chance of surviving to reproduce and passing those genes on to the next generation. And over time, the fitter genes become more common and less fit genes become rarer and may be eliminated. For example, if you're looking at, say, an antelope and a cheetah, there would be an arms race between the two. The antelopes, which are just a little bit faster than the others, stand a better chance of not being eaten by the cheetahs, so that they stand a better chance of reproducing and surviving into the next generation. So that those faster genes will become more common in the future, and that will make that particular gene more common, and that the whole population of antelopes will become faster. Now, a few things about adaptation. One misconception that I've frequently seen is in terms of people think that individuals can adapt. For example, in the spring, the temperature in the 50s feels a lot warmer than the temperature in the 50s in the fall. Or for Christmas break, you went down to the Caribbean, and then you come back and it feels a lot colder than it did before. That's not an adaptation that you became adapted to the colder temperatures, because your genes didn't change. That's known as acclimating. You acclimated to the colder temperatures. Adapting has to do with the genes actually being changed. So it's only populations and species that adapt to a change. So you just have to remember that. This scientific terminology is frequently different from everyday terminology. So you just have to remember that difference. So remember, individuals do not adapt. Species and populations do adapt. And they adapt to that change in the environment when the new variant becomes common, and that enables them to better survive. And also, if the environment changes and the species cannot adapt, then that species becomes extinct. And extinction is something that actually is very common. Most species have become extinct. The speed of evolution is something that depends on the variation. It's sort of like if you are breeding dogs. When you're choosing which dogs to mate, which trait you want to be passed on, you can only choose what's there. You can't choose what's not there. And it's the same thing with evolution. It's not that nature says, okay, I want this to happen, or that the elephant says, okay, I want a longer trunk. It's that there happen to be longer trunks, a variation of trunks, and some longer, some shorter, and the ones that are longer are more fit, so that the elephants with longer trunks happen to survive to reproduce, so that the population ends up with longer trunks, because the shorter ones don't survive and reproduce and die. So the short genes die and the longer genes are more around. So how you end up with more variation? Two basic ways. One is with the higher mutation rate. More mutations increase the amount of variation, which and that makes more genes, increases the chances of adapting to a change. When we see the effect of this would be in one easy way is with two types of viruses. Smallpox virus was one of the most deadly viruses to infect humanity, and you have not gotten a smallpox vaccine. And the reason why is because we found the vaccine for smallpox and we wiped out smallpox. It has a relatively low mutation rate, so that vaccine worked. On the other hand, HIV has a very high mutation rate, and because it has a very high mutation rate, not only have we not been able to get a vaccine not only have we been able to get a vaccine for HIV, but whenever a person is infected with HIV, whenever they find the antibody that works with the antigen on HIV, the HIV evolves. It has all these mutations, and it's ended with all the variations, so they end up with some variants which don't have the antigen that antibody will bind to, So there'll be a new variant which is resistant to those antibodies, and the HIV virus will then adapt to the infected person's immune system and won't be defeated by the immune system and will stay in the body and survive, and the person will still have AIDS. The other way of increasing the speed of evolution is by sexual reproduction. We saw earlier how sexual reproduction increases the amount of variation, and that increased amount of variation will increase the speed of evolution also. Now we come to the concluding questions. Number 1, explain the following elements of natural selection. A, overproduction. B, struggle for existence. C, variation. D, survival of the fittest. Number 2, why do sexually reproducing species evolve faster than asexually reproducing species? Number 3, why can't individuals adapt? That brings us to the end of this podcast, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.